Hello and welcome to another Theory Break video where we take a piece of critical theory and usually try to apply it to a text from popular culture. This week, the uncanny. So what is the uncanny? Well, the concept was first developed by Freud in his 1919 essay, The Uncanny. The uncanny translated is unheimlich, meaning unhomely or unfamiliar. However, crucial to this is that Heimlich and unheimlich are not simple opposites. We usually encounter the uncanny when we're discussing ghost stories, for example, the Victorian ghost story. Even Sarah Waters' fairly recent novel, The Little Stranger, she described writing it being a process of trying to go back to the Victorian ghost story, the sense of the uncanny, not necessarily something that is going to have you screaming in fear, but something that unsettles you. The uncanny, that species of frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar, as Freud says in his essay. We will look at some examples of things that we might call uncanny shortly, but so it's something that's familiar but unfamiliar at the same time, and the result is something that becomes somehow uncomfortably strange. A major question then isn't just what is the uncanny, but also why would something that is somehow familiar but unfamiliar at the same time, why would that affect us on a psychological level? What is happening there? And Freud states very plainly that it's because it reminds us of our own unconscious id and our own repressed desires. Remember, for Freud, our whole life is trauma, really. You're sat here watching this video, but you'd probably rather be doing something else. So whatever it is that you'd rather be doing, to stop yourself from doing that, you've repressed that desire. That goes into your unconscious, and it's traumatic. That has been repressed. Now remember, although the uncanny, like Kristeva's abject, is about something pressing on the border between things, between fantasy and reality, between subject and object, it's not as violent or as visceral necessarily as the abject. It's more about sense of being uncomfortable, that sense of disquiet, a sense of things being very strange, reality not quite working, when reality seems to be a little bit fuzzy around the edges. An uncanny effect often arises when the boundary between fantasy and reality is blurred, when we are faced with the reality of something that we have until now considered imaginary, Freud says. The idea of something being familiar but unfamiliar. There's something again about that betweenness that we seem to come back to a lot when talking about critical theory. So let's have a look at what the uncanny actually is through some of Freud's examples. Not all of Freud's examples, but some of the examples that he gives. We have repetition, we have ghosts, we have the doppelganger or the double, and animism as well. In terms of numbers, imagine, for example, that you happen to spot the number of a train seats when you're sitting down because you're on a trip somewhere, and you see that it's 56B. That number doesn't mean anything to you, and that's fine. Then on your way to the hotel, you get checked in and you realize that your hotel room number is also 57 or 56B, whichever I said. Perhaps you can't remember at that stage. And then at work on the Monday morning or whatever, you're given a letter to pop in the post, and the address is for 156B. Suddenly, those coincidences start to become strange to us. The unintentional return to the same number forces us to entertain the idea of something fateful and perhaps something inevitable. Ghosts, also, one of the main proponents of the uncanny, or examples that have been used to create this feeling of the uncanny. particularly in literature. Why is that? Because there's something very strange about the idea of the ghost, right? They unsettle the distinction between the living and the dead, the real, the unreal, sure, but they're also things that can make noise in the night. Perhaps these phantoms or poltergeists can make things move, put them in other places. They're a useful conduit for the strange and the unexplainable. And though it is strange and unexplainable, they also offer us answers to things that we don't know the answer to, but also perhaps don't want to know the answer to. They make us confront our own mortality as well. And of course, there must be something about the ghost that affects us psychologically, or why else would it have stood the test of time? Another archetype that has stood the test of time is the doppelganger, the twin, the double. The idea of seeing someone, but then seeing that same figure once again. It's not the same figure, but it is. Twins kind of freaks out, especially when they're grown-up people wearing the same clothes, right? There's something strangely peculiar about that. Again, not something that's going to make you turn around and run shrieking for the hills, unless perhaps we're talking about the twins from The Shining. But something unsettling, something that just gives you the creeps, makes your hairs stand on end, gives you a little shiver down your spine. The doppelganger does this to us as well. Think about all the films where this is the case. The twin, the double. The idea that the self may be duplicated, divided, or interchanged. Animism as well, behaving like an animal, or perhaps even morphing into an animal. The idea of transformation. Things like The Fly, body horror, works in this way. But also the end of stories like The Yellow Wallpaper, where the final marker or the exclamation point on the strangeness of this woman's behavior is that she starts crawling around the floor, in a spider-like fashion. Why does this affect us? Well, because it reminds us of our primitive belief systems, apparently. But again, think about all the examples of animism that you've seen, which have stood the test of time in terms of horror. The werewolf, for example. Anything where something is half or other. There's a reason that Dracula can turn into a bat or a wolf, a beast of some kind. It affects us psychologically. It's uncanny. It's strange. It's not right. It's not normal. It's something that affects us and makes those edges of our understanding of reality just shudder a little bit. So some further examples that you might be familiar with, or certainly will be, that we might suggest have this uncanny effect on us. Twins, we've already mentioned. Something as well about the idea of the spooky child, but porcelain dolls as well. Porcelain dolls are uncanny, creepy, because they're almost too lifelike. They've got those eyes that feel like they follow you around the room. The thing that should be object seems like a subject, and that border between the two is broken, or it's made to be a bit porous and fragile. It's become fuzzy at the edges. The binary oppositions, or the structures that we put in place, the borders that we put in place to make sense of the world, suddenly seem a little bit fuzzy. We've got a clown there, and I do just mean a clown. It's a man. He's in makeup. It's strange. It's not quite right. A separate Theory Break video I've done looks at the distinction between Pennywise in the Tim Curry version and the more recent films, and explores it in relation to the abject. But just in general, the idea of the clown is creepy, right? Famously creepy. So many people scared of clowns. We don't really like them. Why? Because there's something slightly strange about them. We've got there an image of Hayden Panettiere from a video game. And what we're getting at here is CGI. CGI that is so good that you recognize the actor involved. However, something's not quite right about them. The eyes, the teeth in particular, still aren't quite right, even with the best CGI. And so that throws us off. We know this person. They're recognizable. But something's not quite right about them. Again, it's that border between familiar and unfamiliar that affects us. In the top right-hand corner, we've got a waxwork, Emma Watson's waxwork. And famously, if you Google this, lots of people essentially creeped out by this and trying to work out why. Well, they're having an uncanny experience. They're experiencing what they call in popular culture the uncanny valley. Why? Because it's almost too lifelike. Something very disturbing about it because it's so lifelike, but it's not quite. That distinction between subject and object is breaking down again. And on then to perhaps the most uncanny of them all. Well, the image there is actually from David Lynch's Lost Highway, a film that definitely is a great exemplar of the uncanny and the experience of the uncanny. In the image scene, this strange man comes over to Bill Pullman's character and says, "I've been to your house. In fact, I'm there right now. Call your house," and offers Bill Pullman the phone and stands there with this strange look on his overly make-upped face with this kind of rictus grin, chuckling as Bill Pullman talks to him at his house while he is stood there at a party talking to him. Creepy, strange, uncanny. But that's not the most uncanny of them all. No, the award, I think, that goes to the most uncanny film of all time must be The Polar Express. In this film, we have all of Freud's examples of the uncanny, including ones we haven't mentioned, like the evil eye. But we have the repetition of numbers. We have the doppelganger in Tom Hanks, who is repeated many times throughout the film as different CGI versions of himself, as different characters in different outfits. And the whole thing has a slightly off-kilter soundtrack, slightly odd production style, where the CGI is so good, it almost looks like lifelike actors, but they are not, and they are children, and they are slightly strange. The whole thing plays out like a weird nightmare. To this day, I still don't know if that is a deliberate choice or just a happy or unhappy accident they've fallen upon. But the film is suffused with that uncanny strangeness of a world where everything feels normal, real, but something's just not quite right. And so it turns into a nightmare. As ever, let me know if you have any questions, theories, comments, or queries, and I will see you next time. Happy Halloween and have sweet dreams.